Welcome, Night Soul. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to help you drift into deep, peaceful sleep. Before we begin, don't forget to like the video and subscribe for more bedtime stories. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. And if there's a story you'd like to hear next, I'd love to know that too. This incident is shared by one of my neighbor whose son named Alan who got disappeared long time ago. Alan had never been the kind of man to believe in ghosts. He was a skeptic by nature, someone who trusted facts and evidence more than whispers and folklore. Growing up, while other kids swapped scary stories around campfires, Alan would roll his eyes and explain the science behind shadows, creaking floors, or the wind in empty halls. But curiosity has its own gravity. By the time he was in his 20s, Alan had built a reputation as an investigator of the unexplained. Not because he wanted to prove ghosts were real, but because he wanted to prove they weren't. Abandoned churches, collapsing farmhouses, even the burned-out shell of an old theater. He had walked through them all, armed with little more than a flashlight and his stubborn disbelief. And that's what brought him here tonight. The hospital loomed against the night sky, its windows dark and hollow, like empty sockets in a skull. The clock on Alan's dashboard struck midnight as he killed the engine, the sound echoing in the silence that surrounded the abandoned lot. Alan took a deep breath, tightened his grip on the flashlight, and stepped out. He had investigated plenty of so-called haunted sites before: church ruins, decaying farmhouses, even a burned-out theater. Every time, it ended the same way: no ghosts, just creaking wood, wind in the rafters, and overactive imaginations. But this hospital had a reputation. Locals said people still heard screams from the old surgical ward. That lights flickered in rooms without power. That anyone who stayed past midnight saw things they couldn't explain. Alan had come to debunk it. To prove that fear was just a trick of shadows and silence. Yet as he pushed through the rusted doors, a chill ran down his spine that had nothing to do with the cold. The entrance hall stretched wide, littered with broken chairs and peeling paint. His footsteps echoed unnaturally, bouncing back too quickly, as though the walls were closer than they looked. The beam of his flashlight swept across the cracked tiles, catching faded words stenciled across the wall. A sound broke the silence. Soft. Metallic. Like something dragging along the floor. Alan froze, straining his ears. It came from deeper inside the hospital. He shook his head. Probably a rat, he muttered. But his voice sounded small, swallowed by the corridors. As he walked forward, he noticed something strange. Every reflective surface, broken windows, cracked glass doors, even puddles of stagnant water, showed his flashlight beam, but not his reflection. The deeper Alan went, the stronger the air smelled of rust and rot. The dragging sound came again, closer this time. He spun, flashlight jerking across the walls. Nothing. But when he turned back, his light landed on a shadow at the end of the hall. It wasn't his. The shape stood tall and twisted, shoulders hunched, its head tilted unnaturally to one side. Alan's breath caught. He lifted the flashlight higher. The shadow was gone. His pulse quickened, but he pressed on, reminding himself shadows couldn't hurt him. His was just a building. Just decayed walls, broken tools, collapsed ceilings. Nothing more. Yet, as he passed a row of empty patient rooms, the doors creaked open behind him. One after another, each hinge groaned until the entire corridor was yawning wide, black mouths opening into darkness. And from deep inside those rooms, he swore he heard whispering. The operating theater loomed ahead. Rows of rusted gurneys were scattered across the floor, surgical tools long abandoned. A single overhead lamp hung by its cord, swaying gently though the air was still. Alan felt the temperature drop. His flashlight flickered. Then he saw it, on the far gurney, a figure lying under a stained sheet. Still. Silent. His breath hitched. He crept closer, his hand trembling as he reached out. With one swift motion, he tore the sheet back. Nothing. Just a rusted frame. Alan exhaled shakily, forcing a laugh. Paranormal, my ass. But then he heard it. His name. Whispered from behind him. Alan. He spun, hard hammering. No one. Nothing but shadows stretched across the walls. And yet his name echoed again, this time from the broken intercom overhead. Alan. Doubt began to creep in. He had always prided himself on logic, on keeping his head clear. But here logic didn't hold. Shadows moved without light. Doors opened without touch. Voices called his name from empty air. His flashlight sputtered, plunging him into darkness for a moment. And in that moment, he felt it, fingers brushing across the back of his neck. Alan stumbled, gasping, swinging his light wildly. And for a split second, he saw himself. Not a reflection, himself. Standing at the other end of the ward, face pale and hollow, eyes black in pits. The double raised a hand, pointing directly at him. The flashlight blinked again, and the figure was gone. Alan's heart raced. His thoughts scattered. He was no longer sure if he was investigating the hospital, or if the hospital was investigating him. The dragging sound returned, louder now. From the shadows at the far side of the theater, something emerged. Not a ghost, not quite human. Its limbs bent wrong, its face obscured by shadow, its body cloaked in a patient's torn gown. Its head tilted, studying him with unseen eyes. Alan raised his flashlight, his voice shaking. "Who's there?" The figure tilted its head further, then whispered in a voice that made his stomach lurch. "Who's there?" It was his own voice. Alan staggered back, realization dawning with icy dread. This wasn't just a haunting. The hospital wasn't full of restless dead, it was full of him. Every shadow, every whisper, every face in the dark. They were him. Memories slammed into him all at once. He hadn't come to debunk the hospital. He hadn't come at all. Alan had died here. Long ago. The surgical theater, the gurney, the sheet, that had been his body once. He had never left. His disbelief, his skepticism, had blinded him to the truth. He wasn't the investigator. He was the haunting. The hospital wasn't echoing his name. It was holding him here. And every terrified trespasser who fled the building in the years since had fled him. The realization should have freed him. It didn't. The walls groaned, the light sputtered, and Alan felt his body dissolve into shadow. His voice fractured into whispers, scattering through the hospital like smoke. He reached out, but his hand was no longer flesh. It was only darkness, curling and twisting. The figure in the gown stepped closer, merging into his form, its hidden face aligning with his. Alan opened his mouth to scream, but only one word came out. "Stay. That hospital wasn't the only place hiding secrets. Let me tell you about another. When my sister Isabella was 17 years old, she visited the old St. Agatha's Hospital with her friends. It had been abandoned for decades, left to rot on the edge of town after a fire gutted half the east wing. Locals whispered that the hospital wasn't empty, that the spirits of the staff and patients still wandered its halls. The most infamous of all was the story of a nurse who never left. Isabella didn't believe in ghost stories. She laughed them off, called them childish, and decided to prove everyone wrong by sneaking inside with her friends. It was supposed to be fun. A dare. A memory to laugh about later. But Isabella never came back out. Her friends said the building was colder than the night outside. Dust and ash coated the tiles, and their footsteps echoed like heartbeats. They carried only flashlights, their thin beams cutting through the black corridors. The smell of mildew and rust hung in the air. One of her friends swore he heard footsteps following them. Another said the shadows stretched wrong, bending against the light. But Isabella, stubborn, fearless Isabella, kept leading them deeper. Until they reached the nurse's station. The counter was still cluttered with files, clipboards scattered across the floor as if dropped mid-shift. The walls were streaked with handprints, dark stains that had never faded. And pinned to the corkboard behind the desk was a photograph. A nurse. Pale uniform. Cap tilted just so. Her eyes too dark, too deep, as though the camera had swallowed her pupils whole. The paper was scorched around the edges, but the smile on her lips looked fresh. That was when the first light flickered out. The group tried to laugh it off, but the sound was shaky. They decided to head back, but the halls no longer looked the same. Corridors twisted. Doors they had passed were gone. The air grew colder, heavy with the smell of antiseptic and smoke. And then they heard it. The click of heels on tile. Slow. Steady. Echoing. The sound of a nurse making her rounds. Isabella raised her flashlight, and froze. At the end of the corridor stood a figure in a starched white uniform. The nurse's cap sat perfectly on her head. Her face was hidden by shadow, but her smile gleamed faintly in the dark. Her hands were stained crimson. The friends screamed and bolted. Isabella didn't. Something in her, maybe curiosity, maybe pride, made her stay rooted as the figure approached. The nurse's voice was soft, like honey poured over broken glass. "You shouldn't be here, child." Her friends fled the building, breathless and terrified. When they looked back, Isabella wasn't with them. They swore they saw the nurse's pale hand on her shoulder just before the door slammed shut. None of them were brave enough to go back inside. They called her name, but the hospital swallowed their voices. The lights in the windows flickered once, twice, then went black. I pieced together what happened from the whispers that followed. Some say Isabella was seen wandering the upper floors that night, her flashlight beam dancing behind cracked glass. Others claimed they heard her laughter echoing, high and broken, long after her friends had run home. But there's one story that chills me most. A man walking his dog past the hospital swore he saw a girl at a second-floor window. Her face was pale, her eyes wide with terror. Behind her stood the nurse, one hand clamped over Isabella's mouth, the other pressing something sharp and gleaming into her chest. He said the girl's lips formed one last word before the light went out. Help! The police searched the building for weeks. They never found Isabella's body. But they found her flashlight. It lay on a gurney in the surgical ward, its beams still faintly glowing, though its batteries had long since corroded. The clipboard next to it had one word scrawled in fresh ink, though no one admitted to writing it. Admitted. Now, years later, people still talk about the nurse of St. Agatha's. They say she collects the young, that she lures them into the hospital and makes sure they never leave. Some say if you pass by at midnight, you'll see a girl in the window, a girl with long dark hair and frightened eyes, banging on the glass. Her mouth will move, but no sound will come out. And behind her, the nurse will be smiling. I know it's true, because the girl they see is my sister, Isabella. And she's still 17. Forever. Now let me tell you a story that still gives me chills. There's an old hospital on the outskirts of town that most people pretend doesn't exist. It's not abandoned, at least, not in the way you'd expect. The lights are always on at night, glowing faintly through the cracked windows, and sometimes you can even hear the faint hum of machines. But no one talks about it, and no one will admit to ever going inside. The strange thing is, patients do go there. You'll hear about someone with a cough, a headache, or just a sore throat, too late for the city clinic, so they try the old hospital instead. They walk in alive and well enough, sometimes even joking about the place, and they always come back out, different. No one ever comes back cured. If they go in with a cold, they return with a raging fever that no medicine can touch. A man once limped and with a sprained ankle. He left with both legs trembling uncontrollably, as if they no longer belonged to him. There was a woman who complained of migraines. When she came back, her eyes darted back and forth like she was watching something no one else could see. And children? The unlucky ones who enter never laugh again. People whisper about the doctors. They look like doctors, wearing spotless white coats, moving through the hallways with the air of authority. Their stethoscopes gleam, their shoes never make a sound, and their eyes never quite blink. They smile politely, speak gently, and lead you down long corridors that feel endless. But no one remembers their faces after leaving, only the feeling of being watched, studied, tested like some specimen in a jar. Inside, the hospital doesn't feel right. The walls are too clean, too white, as if freshly scrubbed of something you're not supposed to see. The air tastes metallic, and the buzzing of fluorescent lights drills into your skull. Some patients have said the clocks never move, that they sat in waiting rooms for hours while the hands stayed frozen at midnight. Others swore they could hear screaming, muffled behind locked doors, but when they asked the nurses about it, they just shook their heads and smiled. What really happens in those wards, no one knows. But the town has its stories. One woman claimed her brother went in for a flu shot and came out convinced that shadows were whispering his name. He hanged himself 2 months later. Another said her aunt went for chest pains, and when she returned, her heart beat so loudly you could hear it from across the room, thudding like a drum until it finally burst. The strangest part? No death certificates ever mention the hospital. It's as though it doesn't exist in records at all. Families are told their loved ones suffered. Natural causes. But the timing is always too neat, too convenient, like someone erasing the truth. Some say the doctors aren't doctors at all. That there's something older, something wearing human skin like a costume. That the hospital is less a place of healing and more a trap, a feeding ground where the sick wander unwillingly, offering themselves up for experiments nobody lives long enough to understand. The town avoids the building now. They don't speak of it, they don't drive past it, and if you ask for directions, they'll tell you to go anywhere else. But if you walk far enough into the night, you'll see its pale lights flickering through the fog, beckoning. And if you're foolish enough to step inside, the doctors will welcome you warmly. They'll take your name, your symptoms, and promise you care. You'll lie down on a bed that smells faintly of bleach, and they'll lean over you with their gleaming instruments. You'll hear the clink of metal, the steady hum of machines, and their calm voices telling you to relax. But you won't leave the same. No one ever does. Many years ago, before anyone called it haunted, the hospital was real. It was built in the 1940s, when the town was small, and people trusted their doctors like priests. But the doctors here weren't healers. They were men of ambition, obsessed with one idea, that the human soul was just another organ, something you could cut open, study, and control. They began in secret. Patients checked in for fevers, broken bones, childbirth. The doctors treated their bodies, yes, but in the back rooms, in the locked wards, they tried something else. Needles that drew out more than blood. Machines that listened to thoughts. Knives that sliced deeper than flesh. They called it soul surgery. At first, it was whispers. Patients leaving the hospital changed. Mothers forgetting their children. Miners staring blankly into the dark, no longer afraid of cave-ins because fear itself had been cut out of them. Some came home stronger. Others came home empty. And then, one winter night, everything went wrong. The doctors gathered in the operating theater, attempting their greatest experiment, the complete removal of a soul. The patient was a young boy, feverish but alive. They strapped him down, just as they do now, and began their work. But when they pulled, when they tore, when they tried to cut the boy's essence away, something answered. Something that was never meant to be touched. The lights shattered. The walls cracked. The boy screamed until his throat tore open, and then his voice kept screaming long after his body went still. Everyone in the hospital died that night. But not one body was ever found. The building remained. The doctors remained too, though not as human anymore. Their hunger had changed them. Their experiments never stopped. They need more souls to replace what was lost, to feed whatever thing now rides in the hospital's walls. That's why no one leaves healed. That's why every cough, every fever, every wound is twisted into something worse. Because the doctors are still practicing. And the hospital is still waiting. If you like to listen to my stories, then subscribe this channel to stay connected.